If you think you had enough of shooting in auto mode and you want to take it up a notch, then stick around and let's talk about manual mode. When I was a beginner, I got the camera out of the box and it was already set to auto mode, and I left it there because I didn't know any better. I was a beginner. I didn't know how to shoot in manual. I didn't know how to shoot in aperture or shutter speed mode, let alone in manual mode. It was simple, it was easy, it was quick, but the photos lacked quality. As I got better at photography, auto mode didn't cut it anymore. I had to take it up a notch. And I started experimenting with aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode, but I always wanted to get to the next level, to the next step, and manual mode was what it was at. If you want to shoot better photos, then you just have to get out of your comfort zone, because for me, auto mode, it is the comfort zone, and manual mode is the unknown. It's frightening, it's scary, but it doesn't have to be. With a little bit of a knowledge and practice, you can do manual mode just as easily as anybody else. And don't get me wrong, manual mode is not the god of modes, okay? You have aperture priority, you have shutter speed priority. Those are just as good as manual mode. Actually, it depends on what kind of photography you do. For me, when I shoot landscapes, I have all the time in the world to set up my shot and dial in my exposure settings, right? The ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. But if you're shooting, let's say, sports, then most likely you would need to shoot in shutter priority mode. When you're shooting sports and everything changes very, very fast, and it's a fast-paced photography genre, then you need to shoot in shutter priority mode because you need that fast shutter. You don't want to be scrambling for adjusting your aperture and your ISO when the action is happening before your eyes. Now, that being said, if you're shooting portraits or if you're shooting landscapes, something more chill, more relaxed, where you have all the time in the world, then I would suggest going to manual mode, because that unlocks even more creative possibilities and your photos will become much, much better. What about you saying, what's wrong with auto mode? Well, for one, the camera doesn't know what your subject is. And two, the camera doesn't know what your creative objective is with the photo. What if you want a shallow depth of field? What if you want a super fast shutter speed? Or what if you want a very slow shutter speed to get that motion blur in the photo? The camera doesn't know that. You know that. That's why you have to shoot in manual. And shooting in manual mode is especially important for those high contrast scenes, like you have a super dark foreground and a very bright sky. The camera will struggle to balance those exposures out and is going to make a mess out of it. Just to give you an example, I'm going to put up on the screen the first photo which I shot in auto mode, and you can probably see right away what kind of mess the photo is in. The camera tried to expose for the whole scene, but the whole scene is so dark and moody that it messes up the shot. The foreground is very dark, the midground where the sun is and the mountains, it's very bright, and the top of the photo where all those heavy clouds are, they're dark. So as you can see, we have a lot of contrast in that image. The camera really tries to balance that exposure out, but it cannot do so because the contrast is too high. And now take a look at this photo I shot in manual mode. Look at that difference. That's what I was after. I wanted a dark, moody photo, and my subject was not the whole scene. The subject was the mountains and the sun casting that beautiful warm glow on top of the mountains. That was my subject, and that's what I was exposing for. So there's a quick tip to get you out of auto mode. Start with putting your camera in auto mode and get a reading of your exposure settings. You have the ISO, you have the shutter speed, and you have the aperture. Now start in auto mode and read those numbers. See what the aperture is giving you, see what the shutter speed is giving you, see what the ISO is giving you. Go to manual mode and input those same numbers for your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now, because this camera, it's a semi-professional body, it's a prosumer camera, professional consumer, It doesn't have auto mode, believe it or not. The closest thing I have to auto mode is program mode, which in program mode, I dial in my ISO and the camera selects the aperture and the shutter speed for the correct exposure. So now I'm in P mode, as you can see over here. And here are my readings. So I set my ISO to the lowest, which is 100. And the camera reads f9 at 320th of a second. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go into manual and input those same settings, which should give me the same exposure. But before we do, let's take a photo in program mode, which is almost auto, and then we go into manual with the same settings and we'll take a photo and we compare the results. So here goes the first photo in program mode. So now I'm going to go into manual and input these same settings. F9, 3/20th of a second, ISO 100. Okay, so I got the shot, and exposure-wise, it's there. It's the same exposure as the program mode one. But the thing is, for my eyes, it's not properly exposed because the foreground is very, very dark. So to mitigate that, I'm gonna adjust my settings to where I like them to be for a proper exposure according to my eyes. I shot the photo at 3/20th, but it was way too dark. I looked at it and I was like, man, that's way too dark. So I had to drop the shutter speed to 100. And that's the thing. Take the photo, but look at it and trust your eyes, because your eyes are the best light meter that there is. So just look at the photo. If you think it's a bit too dark, drop that shutter speed a bit lower. Open up that aperture a little bit more. So like I said, in order to dial in your exposure, you have to dial in the numbers for the shutter speed, for the aperture, and for the ISO. And that's called the exposure triangle. All three work together to get you a proper exposure. Now on the back of the camera, you're going to see this dial here. I also have one in the front of the camera right here. This is for the aperture. This is for the shutter speed. And depending on the camera body, you're going to have them in different locations. Some Canon bodies have those wheels and you just place your thumb on them and you rotate them. But typically what you see on cameras, you have these dials. So these dials, you use them to input the numbers for the shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. Now before I'm going to show you how exactly all these work, there's a very important notion that we have to introduce: the stop of light. What is a stop of light? Well, simply put, a stop of light, it's double or half the quantity of light that we already have falling on our sensor. If we're at f8, let's say, and we want to double the exposure, then we have to go from f8 to f5.6. And by doing that, we doubled the exposure by one stop. Now at the opposite end, if we want to reduce the exposure by one stop, that means we're going to have to get rid of half of the light that's falling onto the sensor. So if again we're at f8, we have to close the aperture all the way down to f11. And the same thing can be said by the shutter speed. So if we're at, let's say, 1,000th of a second and we want to double the exposure, we're going to have to keep the shutter open for longer. For how much longer? Well, for double that amount. So if you're at 1,000th of a second, we're going to have to keep it open for 500th of a second. On the other hand, if we're at 1,000th of a second and we want to cut the exposure by half, we have to increase the shutter speed from 1,000 to 2,000th of a second. And by doing that, we cut the exposure that hits the sensor by half. And the same goes for the ISO. If you're at ISO 100 and you want double the light, you go to ISO 200. If you want double the light of that, you go to ISO 400. If you start at ISO 100 and you want half the light, you go to ISO 50. I'm just gonna change locations real quick because it gets boring if you sit in the same location and you're yapping. So I'm gonna try to find a different one over here. So when you're dialing your exposure, you just have to turn those dials to where you want your exposure to be. The aperture dial, the ISO dial, and the shutter speed dial. You can memorize which way to turn the dial in order to increase your exposure or decrease your exposure. And it's pretty simple. If you go towards the left with the dial, you are increasing your exposure. If you go towards the right, you're decreasing your exposure. Now, careful, this is only valid for the shutter speed and the aperture, the ISO is reverse. If you go towards the left for the ISO, you're decreasing the exposure. If you go towards the right, you're increasing the exposure. So just remember this: shutter speed, aperture. If you want more exposure, you go to the left. For the ISO, if you want more exposure, you go to the right. So let me show you exactly what I mean. Right now I'm at f5.6, 100th of a second, ISO 100. Now what's cool about these dials, the way they are set up, they're set up in increments of thirds. So that means if you rotate the dial 3 times, you will gain 1 stop of light or you will lose 1 stop of light depending on which way you turn the dial. So if I have the shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, if I want double the exposure, I will have to increase my shutter speed by 1 stop. That means I will have to turn the dial 3 times to the left. 1, 2, 3, that puts me at 50th of a second. Same spiel for the aperture. I'm at 5.6. Now if I want to increase my exposure by 1 stop, I have to go towards the left with the dial. So that means from 5.6, 3 clicks, 5.6 to 5, to 4.5 to 4. So it's as simple as that. If you're increasing the shutter speed to let more light come in to the sensor, you're gonna have to close the aperture down to compensate for that light if you want to keep the same exposure. The same if you are increasing your aperture. If you're opening that aperture up, you let more light in, you have to drop the shutter speed to compensate for that increase of light. So let's take a hypothetical example here. I'm at f8, 400th of a second, ISO 100. We're going to leave the ISO at the base ISO level 100, because if you increase the ISO, you're going to get more noise into the image. So we're going to work only with the shutter speed and the aperture. So I have the aperture at f8 and the shutter speed at 400th of a second. Now, let's say I want the photo to be more sharp because I'm photographing this grass here in the foreground. By increasing the aperture, you're going to have more elements in focus from front to back. So because I'm at f8, I want to increase the aperture all the way to f16. If I take a photo just like this without compensating with my shutter speed, the photo will be dark because I closed down the aperture and I didn't do anything to the shutter speed. So now we're at f8, and let's count the clicks that will take us to get to f16. So we started at f8 and we have f9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 clicks. So from f8 to f16, that's 6 clicks. That's 2 stops actually, if you think about it, because there's 3 clicks per stop, right? So there's 2 stops. So now to compensate with the shutter speed, we have to increase the shutter speed to get more light onto the sensor. So because we had 6 clicks for the aperture, we're gonna have to have 6 clicks for the shutter speed, but in the opposite way. So if for the aperture we went to the right to increase it and cut the light that falls onto the sensor, now for the shutter speed we're gonna have to go to the left to let more light onto the sensor. So if we had 6 clicks towards the right for the aperture, we're going to have 6 clicks towards the left for the shutter speed, and that will compensate and will get us the same exact exposure that we had before. So we're at 400th of a second, and let's go 6 clicks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which puts us at 100th of a second. Makes sense. Half of 400 is 200, half of 200 is 100. 3 clicks per stop, that's 6 clicks. So now let's take an example for the shutter speed. I'm at this water edge over here and I'm photographing this scene over here. My settings are f2.8 at 200th of a second, ISO 100. So f2.8 at 200th of a second. I take a photo. And the photo is okay, it's pretty good. But what if I want to smooth out the water? I really want to get these super small waves as smooth as I can. So for that, I'm gonna have to drag my shutter speed for a longer amount of time. So let's do that. I want to go to a shutter speed of half a second. So let's see, from 200th of a second we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 20 clicks to the left, and because of that I have to compensate for the aperture with 20 clicks to the right. So let's do that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So with 18 clicks I reached the maximum of my aperture. It closes at f22, so I have 2 clicks left to have the same exposure as the previous photo. So what can I do? Well, because I am at ISO 100, I can drop the ISO lower with 2 clicks. So let's do that. 100, 0.3, 0.7. So now with 18 clicks to the right for the aperture and with 2 clicks for the ISO, I am balanced out on the exposure. So let's take the photo. Just remember this: if you want more light, turn the dial to the left. If you want less light, turn the dial to the right. The trick is to go out, take a camera and play with the settings so you can understand what I'm talking about, so you can get a feel of them. That's the most important thing. Go out, play with the dials, take photos, see what they do, because theory it's okay, but if you don't practice, that's not going to lead you anywhere. I hope this wasn't too complicated of a video. I'm going to stick around here, take a couple more photos, because we have a beautiful sky, beautiful colors as it's sunset. Oh wow, look at that sunset. Isn't it cool? You kidding me? Look at that light. Oh crap, that's good. I'm at f22 ISO 50, 1 second. That sun is super bright. Beautiful. I have this beautiful reflection of the sunlight onto the surface of the ocean over here, and I framed that so I can have it right in the middle. That's pretty much it. I'll see you in the next episode, and until then I wish you nothing but peace. Take care. Ciao.